Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. What do you do when an HOA you never joined starts fining you anyway? $50 a day, then $100, then $200, until the total looks like a mortgage. I laughed. Until my security camera sent a motion alert in the middle of a meeting. Why was the HOA president on my property with a ladder? After 3 packages disappeared from my front porch in the span of 2 weeks last spring, I finally bit the bullet and installed a proper camera system around my house. Nothing crazy, just 4 high-end 4K cameras covering all the angles: front door, driveway, side yards, and the back. Crystal clear footage, night vision, motion alerts sent straight to my phone. The whole setup cost me about $2,000, but after losing a replacement laptop that got stolen mid-delivery, I figured it was worth every penny. My house sits in kind of a weird spot geographically. I bought it about 8 years ago and I love everything about it. It's got this deep blue front door that I painted myself, flower beds that actually have some personality instead of the standard HOA approved shrubs, and a little stone path leading up to the entrance that the previous owner installed. The place has character, you know? It was built in the late 90s, sits on a nice half-acre lot, and honestly I couldn't be happier with it. About 3 years after I moved in, a developer bought up all the farmland behind and beside my property and started throwing up one of those massive planned communities. You know the type. Every house looks basically identical: beige or gray siding, black shutters, perfectly manicured lawns that all use the same landscaping company. The whole neighborhood went up fast, maybe 2 years from breaking ground to completely sold out. These weren't small houses either. Big 4 and 5 bedroom places, all crammed relatively close together, each one probably pushing 3,000 square feet. The thing is, my property sits right at the main entrance to this whole development. There's only one way in and out of the subdivision, and you have to drive right past my house to get there, so everyone coming and going sees my place first. I guess that became a problem for some people because my house definitely doesn't match their aesthetic. My blue door probably offends their neutral color palette sensibilities. My garden has wildflowers and herbs instead of uniform boxwoods. I've got a small vegetable patch on the side that's visible from the street. Basically, my house looks like someone actually lives there and enjoys it, rather than something staged for a real estate photo shoot. When they were building the neighborhood, I got a few pieces of mail asking if I wanted to join the HOA. I looked over the rules and restrictions, saw the annual fees, read through the ridiculous list of things you couldn't do on your own property, and politely declined. My house was there first. I wasn't interested in paying someone to tell me what color I could paint my own front door. I thought that was the end of it, and for a couple of years it was. Then about 6 months ago, the HOA got a new president. I started seeing her around pretty quickly. She drove through the neighborhood in a golf cart with a clipboard, patrolling like some kind of suburban security guard. She was probably in her mid-40s, always dressed like she was about to attend a business meeting even though she was just riding around looking at people's houses. Perfectly styled hair, designer athleisure wear, the kind of person who probably introduces herself with her full name and expects you to be impressed. I didn't think much of her at first. She lived somewhere in the development, 3 or 4 streets back from the main road, and our paths never really crossed. I'd see her golf cart rolling past my house sometimes, and occasionally I'd catch her staring at my property as she went by, but whatever. Some people have too much time on their hands. That all changed about a week after I got my cameras installed. I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon, pulled into my driveway, and immediately noticed something flapping on my front door. As I got closer, I could see it was a piece of paper taped right across my beautiful blue paint. I pulled it off, slightly annoyed that someone had put tape directly on my door, and started reading. The document, and I use that term loosely, was titled Official Notice of Violation in big bold letters at the top. Below that, it rambled on about unauthorized surveillance equipment and something about disrupting neighborhood privacy standards. The grammar was atrocious. There were at least 3 spelling mistakes that I caught on the first read-through. It demanded that I remove all exterior cameras from my property within 48 hours or face escalating fines starting at $50 per day. At the bottom there was a signature, the new HOA president, naturally. I actually laughed out loud standing there on my porch. This had to be some kind of joke or mistake. My cameras pointed at my own property in the public street. They didn't peer into anyone's windows or record anyone's private space. They were completely legal, and more importantly, I wasn't even in the HOA. This woman had clearly seen my cameras, assumed I was part of her little kingdom, and decided to flex her newfound authority. I crumpled up the notice and tossed it in my kitchen trash. Problem solved, right? She'd realize her mistake eventually, and that would be that. I was so wrong. 2 days passed without incident. I figured the HOA president had checked the records, seen that my property wasn't included in the association, and dropped the issue. I should have known better. On Friday afternoon, I was in my driveway washing my car, enjoying the nice weather and actually using the hose for once instead of going to the automated car wash. I had music playing from my phone and I was in a genuinely good mood. That's when the golf cart pulled up to the curb in front of my house. She climbed out with her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield and marched up my driveway with the kind of confidence that only comes from being completely sure you're in the right. I turned off the hose and waited, curious to see how this would play out. She stopped about 6 feet away from me and launched right into it without even a greeting. Why were the cameras still up? Didn't I receive her notice? Was I aware that I was now accruing daily fines? Did I think the rules just didn't apply to me? I kept my voice level and polite. I explained that the cameras were on my private property, that they only recorded my own yard and the public street, and that I had no intention of removing them. I didn't mention the HOA boundary issue yet. Part of me was curious to see how far she'd take this before figuring it out herself. Her face started turning red almost immediately. She told me that I was being difficult and unreasonable. She claimed that I was recording her children, which made absolutely no sense since she lived several streets away, and there was no possible way my cameras could see anywhere near her house. She told me that if I didn't comply, she would personally make sure the fines buried me, and that eventually the association would place a lien on my property for unpaid fees. I asked her a simple question. Could she show me where exactly it stated she had the authority to enforce these rules on my property? She got even more flustered at that, sputtering something about HOA bylaws and neighborhood standards and how everyone had to follow the same rules. Then she told me I'd be receiving official invoices for the fines, and that I'd better start taking this seriously before it got out of hand. She turned around and practically stomped back to her golf cart, then drove off with a dramatic little acceleration that made the cart's electric motor whine. I finished washing my car, but the good mood was pretty much gone. I had a feeling this wasn't over. Sure enough, 3 days later I found something in my mailbox. Not a notice taped to my door this time, but an actual invoice printed on fancy paper. It had a running total of my supposed fines. $50 for the first day of violation, then $100 for the second, then $200 for the third. The amounts kept doubling. According to this document, I now owed the HOA over $3,000. I took the invoice inside and started a file folder specifically for this nonsense. I labeled it HOA harassment and tucked the paper inside. If this was going to escalate, I wanted documentation of everything. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 more invoices. Each one showed an increasing total, with the daily fines continuing to double. By the end of the second week, the HOA claimed I owed them over $40,000. It would have been funny if it wasn't so brazenly fraudulent. I kept every single invoice, noting the dates they arrived and adding them to my growing file. I also started noticing the golf cart patrol increasing in frequency. The HOA president would drive past my house multiple times a day, slowing down to stare at the cameras mounted on my eaves. Sometimes she'd stop completely and just sit there in her cart, writing things on her clipboard. I caught all of this on camera, naturally. Every single drive-by, every long stare, every moment she spent parked in front of my property. The motion alerts on my phone were going off so frequently that I had to adjust the sensitivity settings. Then came the day that made me realize the situation had gone from annoying to potentially serious. I was at work, sitting in a meeting that was running long, when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my front door camera. I ignored it at first, figuring it was probably just a delivery or someone turning around in my driveway, but then I got another alert, and another. 3 alerts in less than 2 minutes was unusual. During a lull in the meeting, I quietly pulled out my phone under the table and opened the camera app to check the live feed. What I saw made my stomach drop. The HOA president was standing in my driveway with some guy I'd never seen before. He was holding an extension ladder, one of those tall ones that expands to reach second-story heights. They were both looking up at the camera mounted above my front door, and the guy was positioning the ladder against my house. They were actually going to try to remove my cameras themselves. I don't think I've ever ended a meeting faster in my life. I mumbled something about an emergency at home, grabbed my stuff, and headed for the door. But before I left the building, I had an idea. I pulled up the camera app again, found the two-way audio feature that I'd honestly never used before, and pressed the button to speak. My voice came out of the tiny speaker in the camera, loud and clear in my empty driveway. I told them to step away from my property immediately and that the police had already been notified of their trespassing. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely worth it. Both of them jumped like they'd been shocked. The guy actually dropped the ladder and it clattered loudly against my front steps. The HOA president looked around wildly, trying to figure out where my voice was coming from, and then her eyes landed on the camera. The look on her face when she realized I was watching and recording everything was priceless. They practically ran back to the golf cart, leaving the ladder lying in my driveway, and took off down the street. I saved that video file immediately and made 3 backup copies. Then I called a property lawyer whose name I'd gotten from a coworker a few months back. I'd never needed a lawyer before, but this seemed like the right time to change that. The lawyer's office got me in for a consultation the next day. I brought my entire file folder, now stuffed with fraudulent invoices, and I had the video footage of the attempted camera removal loaded on my phone. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s who'd been practicing property law for over 20 years, listened to my whole story without interrupting. Then she asked to see the documentation. She went through each invoice carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I showed her the video of the trespassing incident, she actually smiled. She explained that what the HOA was doing constituted harassment, attempted fraud, and in the case of the latter incident, criminal trespass with intent to commit vandalism. She said we had an extremely strong case and that she'd be happy to draft a cease and desist letter to send to the HOA board. But I had a different idea. I asked her about the HOA's meeting schedule. Were those typically open to neighborhood residents? She confirmed that most HOA meetings had to be open to all homeowners in the association, and usually they allowed guests to attend as well. I did some digging online that evening and found the HOA's website. It was one of those template sites that looked like it had been thrown together in about 20 minutes, but it did have a calendar. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center in the subdivision. Perfect. The lawyer drafted the cease and desist letter, but instead of mailing it, we agreed that I'd deliver it in person at the meeting. She also helped me prepare a few other documents, a detailed property survey showing the exact boundaries of my land and where the HOA's jurisdiction began, a timeline of all the harassment including dates and descriptions of each incident, printed screenshots from my camera footage showing the trespassing attempt, and copies of every single fraudulent invoice I'd received. I spent the week preparing, making sure I had multiple copies of everything and trying not to feel too nervous about the public confrontation I was about to initiate. This wasn't really my style. I'm generally pretty conflict averse, the kind of person who avoids drama whenever possible, but the HOA president had pushed this way too far, and I was done being polite about it. Thursday evening arrived. I dressed in business casual clothes, gathered all my documents into a neat folder, and drove the short distance to the community center. The parking lot was already pretty full when I arrived. Apparently these meetings drew a decent crowd. The meeting room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table at the front. The HOA board members were already seated at the table, 5 people total, including the president, who sat right in the middle. She had a different clipboard tonight, and she kept glancing at it and writing notes. She looked very much in her element, clearly enjoying her position of authority. I took a seat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous. A few residents trickled in after me, and by the time the meeting started at 7, there were probably 40 or 50 people in attendance. The meeting began with standard boring HOA stuff. Budget reports, discussion about the community pool maintenance schedule, a debate about whether the neighborhood entrance sign needed repainting. I sat quietly, waiting and watching. The HOA president ran the meeting with an iron fist, cutting people off when they tried to speak too long, dismissing concerns with a wave of her hand, generally behaving like someone who'd let a tiny amount of power go completely to her head. About 30 minutes into the meeting, during a lull in the discussion, she cleared her throat and announced that she wanted to address a matter of neighborhood security and rule enforcement. This was it. She launched into a speech about how important it was to maintain standards in the community, and how some people thought they were above the rules that everyone else had to follow. She specifically mentioned a property at the neighborhood entrance that was creating privacy concerns with unauthorized surveillance equipment. She said the homeowner had been notified multiple times about the violation and had refused to comply. She went on to say that the fines had been accruing for weeks now, and that if payment wasn't received soon, the board would have no choice but to place a lien on the property to recover the owed funds. A few people in the audience were nodding along. Some looked confused. A couple of residents turned around trying to figure out if the person she was talking about was in the room. I stood up from my seat in the back. The movement caught her attention immediately and her eyes landed on me. I saw recognition flash across her face, followed quickly by anger, and then something that might have been nervousness. I walked down the center aisle toward the front of the room, folder in hand. Nobody said anything. The entire room had gone quiet, everyone watching to see what was about to happen. I reached the front and asked if I could use the projector screen that was set up for the budget presentation. One of the other board members, an older man who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation, nodded and gestured toward the laptop connected to the projector. I pulled up the first document I'd prepared, a detailed property map showing the boundaries of my land and the exact point where the HOA's jurisdiction began. The map showed clearly that my property sat entirely outside the HOA's boundaries, predating the development by nearly 2 decades. I let that sink in for a moment before I spoke. I introduced myself, stated my address, and then delivered the news that apparently nobody on the board had bothered to verify before launching their harassment campaign. I was not, and had never been, a member of the HOA. The room erupted. People started talking all at once, some asking questions, some expressing disbelief. The other board members were looking at the HOA president with expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. One woman at the end of the table had her hand over her mouth. The president was stammering, trying to form words. She said something about how everyone in the neighborhood had to follow the rules, that it didn't matter whether I was technically in the HOA or not. I moved on to the next part of my presentation. I pulled out the stack of fraudulent invoices and placed them on the table in front of the board. Over $40,000 in fake fines, I announced, for violations that never occurred, issued by an organization that had no authority over my property whatsoever. Then came the best part. I pulled up the video footage on the projector. Crystal clear 4K video of the HOA president and her hired handyman bringing a ladder onto my property, positioning it against my house, clearly intending to remove my cameras without permission or legal authority. I let about 30 seconds of the video play, including the part where my voice came through the camera speaker and they both scattered. A few people in the audience actually gasped. Someone laughed, then tried to cover it with a cough. I explained that I had already filed a police report for attempted vandalism and criminal trespass. I stated that my lawyer had prepared a cease and desist letter, copies of which I was now distributing to each board member. I walked along the table, placing a letter in front of each person. Then I delivered the final point. If any attempt was made to place a lien on my property, or if the harassment continued in any form, I would pursue legal action against both the HOA president personally and the HOA board collectively. I mentioned that my lawyer was very confident about our chances in court, especially given the video evidence and the paper trail of fraudulent invoices. I thanked them for their time and walked back toward my seat. The room exploded again the moment I sat down. The other board members were frantically reading the cease and desist letters. Several residents were shouting questions. Someone demanded to know if the board had verified property boundaries before taking enforcement action. Another person asked how much this potential lawsuit might cost the HOA in legal fees. The HOA president was trying to restore order, but nobody was listening to her anymore. The other board members had turned on her instantly, their concern about personal liability overriding any sense of solidarity. One board member, a man in a suit who I later learned was a CPA, kept asking why she hadn't checked the property records before issuing fines. Another was demanding to know who authorized the attempted camera removal. I didn't stick around for the rest of the meeting. I'd said what I needed to say and delivered all the documentation. Whatever happened next was between the board members and their insurance company. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and walked into my house feeling exhausted but satisfied. My phone was buzzing with motion alerts because apparently a bunch of residents had decided to drive past my house after the meeting to see the property that had caused all the drama, but I ignored them. I made dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed early. The next morning, I woke up to find that my motion alerts had captured something interesting during the night. Around 11 o'clock, a car had pulled up to my curb. The HOA president had gotten out, walked up to my mailbox, and deposited something inside. She'd looked absolutely miserable in the footage, her shoulders slumped, no sign of the confident swagger she'd displayed just a few weeks earlier. I went outside in my pajamas to check the mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter, not typed this time, on plain notebook paper. It was her resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a brief statement that she was stepping down due to personal reasons. I took the letter inside and added it to my file folder, which I was keeping just in case. Over the next few days, I heard through casual conversations with a few neighbors who were friendly that the HOA board meeting had continued for another 2 hours after I left. Apparently, it had turned into a full interrogation of the now former president about her actions. The other board members had been furious about the potential legal exposure she'd created for all of them. There was talk about whether the HOA's insurance would cover a lawsuit for harassment or whether board members could be held personally liable. The general consensus seemed to be that she'd acted completely on her own, that the rest of the board hadn't approved or even been informed about the fines or the attempted camera removal. Whether that was actually true or just them covering their backs, I didn't really care. My problem had been with her specifically, and she was gone. About a week after her resignation, I got another motion alert while I was making breakfast. This time it was 2 board members, different ones from the previous president, walking up to my front door. They were empty-handed, looking nervous. I answered the door and they immediately started apologizing. They explained that they'd done a full investigation into what had happened, that they'd reviewed all the records, and that they wanted to formally apologize for the harassment I'd endured. They assured me that all the fake invoices had been voided, that there would be no lien attempt, and that I would never receive any further communication from the HOA regarding my property. One of them mentioned that they'd also banned the former president from any future board positions or HOA leadership roles, though I wasn't sure how effective that would be since she could theoretically just move. I accepted their apology, mostly because they seemed genuinely embarrassed about the whole situation, and I got the sense they hadn't actually been involved in the day-to-day harassment. We chatted for a few minutes about neighborhood stuff, and then they left. 2 days later, I got yet another motion alert. This time it showed a delivery person leaving a large basket on my front porch. When I brought it inside, I found it was full of expensive snacks, wine, and a card signed by the current HOA board members. The card repeated their apologies and thanked me for not pursuing legal action. The irony of my security cameras capturing the delivery of an apology basket for trying to make me remove those same security cameras wasn't lost on me. I saved that video too, just for my own amusement. Life returned to normal after that. My cameras continued doing exactly what I'd installed them to do, which was monitor my property and give me peace of mind. I never had another package stolen, though I'm not sure if that was because of the cameras or just because the local thief had moved on to greener pastures. The former HOA president still lived in the neighborhood, which made things occasionally awkward. I'd see her car drive past sometimes, always moving a bit faster than necessary. The driver's eyes carefully pointed straight ahead. She never looked at my house, never made eye contact if we happened to be outside at the same time. A few months after the whole incident, I noticed her house go up for sale. It sold pretty quickly, and then she was gone. The new HOA leadership turned out to be much more reasonable. They focused on actual community issues like organizing neighborhood events and maintaining common areas, rather than nitpicking about individual property choices. I occasionally saw the new board president when I was out getting my mail, and we'd exchange friendly waves. Looking back on the whole situation, I'm still amazed at how completely the former president had convinced herself that she had authority over my property. The delusion required to not only issue fake fines, but to actually attempt physical removal of my cameras is pretty staggering. All she had to do at any point was check the property records, which are public information, and she would have seen immediately that I wasn't part of the HOA. But she was so certain that she was right, so invested in her power trip, that she never bothered to verify. The cameras are still up, still recording in crystal clear 4K, Every time I check the app on my phone and see my peaceful HOA-free property, I'm reminded of why I installed them in the first place. They were supposed to protect me from package thieves. I never expected they'd end up protecting me from something much more annoying, but I'm glad they were there when I needed them. And honestly, after everything that happened, I think I might upgrade to even better cameras next year. Maybe add a couple more angles. Not because I'm worried about HOA harassment anymore, but because the technology has improved and the newer models have even better night vision. Plus, after watching that video of the attempted camera removal about 100 times, I've developed a real appreciation for good security footage. The best part of this whole story might be how it ended without any actual legal action. Just the threat of consequences backed up by solid evidence and documentation was enough to make everything go away. The former president resigned, the HOA backed off completely, and I got to keep my cameras exactly where they were. Sometimes the satisfaction doesn't come from winning a lawsuit, but from watching people realize they've made a terrible mistake and having to face the consequences of their own actions. My house still sits at the entrance to the subdivision, still standing out with its blue door and personality-filled garden. And if that bothers anyone driving past, well, that's not my problem. They're welcome to join me on my side of the property line, where HOA rules don't exist, and homeowners can actually make their own decisions about their own property. I water my herb garden with the same hose I was using the day the whole thing started, and every time I do, I glance up at those cameras and smile. Best $2,000 I ever spent. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 10 years ago, I worked for a small web hosting company. Initially, I was hired as entry-level support, taking calls from customers that accidentally broke their websites or needed passwords reset. Then, I worked my way up to team lead where I was working with SSL certificates and cloud hosting accounts for high-value customers. Finally, they moved me to the marketing team after they found out that I had an English writing degree. This was my first copywriting job and a huge step in my career, as I am still a copywriter to this day. I remember being overjoyed when I accepted the position and thought, I'm never taking another angry phone call for the rest of my life. Cut to about a year later. I'm writing blogs, emails, video scripts, and most importantly, not taking phone calls. I'm at my desk in the marketing department, and in walks the team lead that took my position after I was promoted. We'll call her Ruth. Side note, I objected to Ruth being promoted into my old role because she's extraordinarily bullheaded and rude. She would repeatedly overstep her bounds as an entry-level tech, telling other employees when they could and couldn't go to lunch and trying to manage the call queue when her only job was to take said calls. Ultimately, my concerns went unheeded, and she got the job. Ruth walks up to my desk and sets a bulleted list in front of me. It's a vague business strategy she's written up. Essentially, the cloud hosting division of the company is rapidly expanding, and the CSO tasked Ruth with figuring out how to field all of the additional high-value customers. Ruth's solution? I resume some of my responsibilities as a tech team lead to take escalations from angry cloud customers. I said absolutely not. She completely ignored me and just kept going over her strategy. Like, literally I'm saying, no, Ruth, I'm not doing this. And she's like, Anyway, as you can see here, when a tech needs to escalate a call, it will come to you. I was fuming, but patiently explained that I was on the marketing team now and my tech support days are over. She said, well, I checked the roles and responsibilities section in the company handbook, and there's nothing that says the marketing team doesn't work directly with clients. She then gave me a crap-eating grin and says, we'll have to get a phone installed at your desk, and leaves. I was ducking livid. I'd be going from no phone calls to specifically only taking calls from the angriest customers we have. Then as I was recounting this awful situation to one of the graphic designers, something dawned on me when I remembered what she said about the roles in the company handbook. As the only copywriter, I was the one in charge of managing and updating the handbook. The graphic designer saw this dawn of realization on my face and was like, oh man, please do what I think you're gonna do. So I logged into Evernote, or whatever system we were using to manage and edit the handbook, and added a subsection to the marketing team's roles and responsibilities that specifically said we do not take phone calls, emails, or have any direct interactions with customers. This also safeguarded the graphic designers and videographers from any future bullcrap from Ruth. I took the changes to the CSO, who gave me a smirk and signed off on the edits. I then took the signed changes to Ruth and set them on her desk. Yeah, actually it does say in the company handbook that the marketing team can't take calls, as you can see here. I guess you'll have to figure something else out. She stared daggers at me, but I just shrugged and left. That was the last of our interactions. She ended up poaching some top performers from the entry-level tech team to make a dedicated cloud team that never really functioned well, and she ultimately quit without a 2-week notice a few months later. So, I got some extra I told you so satisfaction about her not being qualified for the job as well. I still haven't taken a single customer phone call since I became a copywriter, and I intend to keep it that way. The next one is an entitled people story. I, 43F, am an anxious flyer, not due to fear of flying, but fear of people. So I'm pretty happy with how I'm handling this situation that's happening right now. I'm flying back from a vacation in Costa Rica. I paid extra for priority and an exit row seat. The flight was supposedly full, but somehow the middle seat next to me, I'm in an aisle seat, is empty. It's a 4-hour flight, so not having to rub shoulders with a stranger is a welcome surprise. I get all settled in, my electronics are charging, I have stuff in the seat back, Wi-Fi connected, and then order some food and drinks from the flight attendant. Having an extra tray table between me and the window seat passenger is also quite helpful. Just as I'm starting my snacks and mixed my drink, the guy across the aisle from me, 50s M, asks if the middle seat is empty. I have to take off my headphones and then respond, "Yup," and put my headphones back on. A couple minutes later, he starts talking at me again, so I remove my headphones again. He says, "Hey, switch seats with me so that my wife in the back of the plane can come up and sit next to me in that empty middle seat." I say, "Well, I'm all settled in right now and don't really want to move while eating, but if you wait..." He interrupts me to say it'll be really easy to switch all our stuff, and I again start to say that I will switch when I'm done eating, but he doesn't even listen to me, just talks over me saying things like, "Unbelievable, so I can't sit next to my wife because you won't just do a simple thing like switch one aisle seat for another. So ridiculous. How unbelievably rude." I kept trying to tell him to just wait a few minutes, but now he's pissing me off. He never asked, never said please, and immediately just started talking loudly and gesturing around to everyone, telling them how unbelievable I am. So then he finally takes a breath and says, "Well, how about after you finish eating, then you'll switch?" To which I say, "As I was telling you, I would be fine switching after I eat, but not after you've been so rude. Now I'm not going to switch with you at all." Of course, this makes him incensed. He continues to bluster and bloviate about how I'm so unbelievable in keeping him from his poor wife that is sitting with strangers. How dare I? Then he again tries to talk to the man next to him about how evil I am and just starts leaning across the aisle and glaring right at me from 18 inches away from my face, shaking his head and making disappointment noises. At some point, he mumbles under his breath, and I think he said idiot, but it was hard to hear as I put my headphones back on and just ignored him. For the next hour, he continued to glare and yell back to his wife that I was preventing them from sitting together. So I just completely ignored him and texted my friends, laughing and smiling a lot, just pissing him off more, but not doing anything wrong or engaging him in any way. We are about an hour from landing at this point, and he seems to have given up and is just leaning back and not staring at me anymore. I have a feeling he is going to say something when we are disembarking, either to me or the people around us, about how unbelievable and ridiculous I am. My plan is to just half smile wryly and say, "Okay." I'm going to try my best to not take the bait and get in an argument because there isn't any point with people like this, but I know it will be hard for me. Any advice? Also, let me know what you would say in a situation like this. If this guy was capable of listening, I would tell him it's his own fault for not upgrading his wife's seat and getting seats next to each other before the flight. I also want to reiterate that I would have switched, even though I didn't want to until he became so rude and entitled. But I doubt it would make a difference, so I'm just not going to give any reaction instead. Thanks for reading. I am trying to buck up before the plane lands. I hate being in situations like this, but hate giving in to bullies even more. Anyway, thank you for watching.